I just saw a Liz Cheney clip posted by Representative Dan Bishop, and it had her describing Trump's run for president in 2024 as potentially the last election in American history. This echoes a long line of foreign policy establishment apex predators who are all now suddenly in unison championing this framing of Trump as a dictator, as an authoritarian. This is obviously stuff they've recycled from before, but it's all sort of converging right now. And, you know, this attack on democracy, dictator, authoritarian thing. And especially this framing of it being the last election if we don't stop it. Now, you have to recognize the trick here and go all the way back to the beginning. The framing techniques they're using right now are the same ones used in 1948 at the very dawn of the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency to create a predicate for dirty tricks. I'll talk about what those dirty tricks are going to be, but just a quick history lesson here. The CIA was created under the 1947 National Security Act, and the very first thing it did to rig an election overseas was to rig the 1948 Italian election, which was the first democratic election after World War II. You know, after Mussolini had been gored, and suddenly Italy was torn between a Euro-Atlanticist, Western-backed political candidate for president and a Soviet-backed communist sympathetic president. And the Central Intelligence Agency, with support from the State Department and certain private interests, and certain interests within Italy itself, ranging from the Sicilian mob, who our national security state had partnered with because they were persecuted by Mussolini. So Italian street muscle was used as a sort of makeshift resistance movement within Italy. We kept those networks with the underground and with media institutions and propaganda institutions. We bribed, cajoled, stuffed ballot boxes, the whole dirty works that you could possibly do. And George Kennan wrote, he's one of the godfathers of the CIA, he wrote a memo after this happened. It's called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare, published later that year in 1948, where he explains the logic of it and basically, you know, writes a letter essentially to the intelligence community saying, listen, we're in the business of dirty tricks now after World War II has ended, because if we don't do dirty tricks, the Bolsheviks will, and these dirty tricks work. And he goes on to explain that the problem is if the communist candidate had won the presidency there in Italy, then there would be no elections in Italy again, possibly. So we had to rig this one. We had to stuff ballot boxes. We had to work with the mob to bust up any pro-Soviet meetings that were happening in Italy. We had to use street muscle. We had to go dirty using CIA tricks to rig the election because it might be the last election ever if we don't. So it was a predicate used to establish a protocol around doing things that you're not normally allowed to do in an election cycle if someone poses an existential threat to, you know, the system of governance that they call democracy. Now, we saw this happen in 2020. For example, the Transition Integrity Project, which was this 65-person, hugely influential group of people. This included Donna Brazile, the former head of the DNC, Michael Steele, the former head of the RNC, so the two most recent heads of both major political parties, as well as about 60-some officials from the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the intelligence community, and then other cluster networks around everything from journalism to champions of industry. And they had a role-play simulation about how to overturn the 2020 election. This is in June 2020, 5 months before the election happened, about how they could overturn the election if Trump won to save democracy and make sure that he would not be able to have a second term. They had simulation 3. I've posted this a million times, but I'll put it in the thread below. They did 4 simulations. In simulation number 3, John Podesta personally played a role-playing role of Joe Biden. John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager and now runs the largest pot of money in the entire federal government, a $370 billion slush fund for energy projects. He personally role-played the role of Joe Biden. And what did they do? it was in this role play. It was dirty tricks. The simulation went as follows. If Trump won a quote, clear victory at the Electoral College, but had lost the popular vote, they were going to mobilize Black Lives Matter street muscle. They wrote this. Mobilize Black Lives Matter street muscle and use their anger to essentially become a pro-Biden anarcho-tyranny force that would shut down the country as a color revolution does in Serbia or in Tunisia, or as the CIA organizes abroad. Who was the head of the Transition Integrity Project, by the way? It was a woman named Rosa Brooks, who was a former high-ranking Pentagon official, who in her own book talks about how she had a CIA blue badge, which allows you to access essentially the inner sanctum of the CIA, and is currently sort of masquerading as a, maybe that's too strong a word, but is currently employed as a professor of democratization studies at Georgetown, which if you know what that means she teaches courses on how to overthrow governments. Now, as we know, from the Time magazine article that came out just weeks after the election, it turned out that the Chamber of Commerce had a deal struck with the AFL-CIO, which used to be called the AFL-CIA by folks back in the 1960s because of how closely it worked with the Central Intelligence Agency as street muscle for overthrowing foreign countries, as what happened in Poland with the trade unions there under Lech Walesa, and in many other countries, but I'll save that for another time. The Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO came to a mutual agreement for a stand-down of the destabilizing protests they had planned if Trump had won the election. The Time magazine article stipulates this. Now, wouldn't you know, the Chamber of Commerce and the unions are two of the four stools of the National Endowment for Democracy, which has four branches. The National Democratic Institute, which is for basically Democrat Party payoffs on foreign policy initiatives. The International Republican Institute, which is for Republican Party payoffs on international initiatives. The Center for International Private Enterprise, which is the Chamber of Commerce wing of the CIA cutout. And the Solidarity Center, which is the street muscle labor union wing of the CIA cutout, known as the National Endowment for Democracy. So you had these blob creatures in charge of these destabilization plans. We know that the same way these kind of destabilization protests to shut down the ability to govern are done by our national security state abroad, it happened to have an identical structure in 2020, and it was all done on this predicate that if we don't stop this now, if this man, even if he wins fair and square, the country won't be normal after. There will be the last election ever. The same phrasing they used to justify rigging the Italian election in 1948. This is the predicate to set up those same Department of Dirty tricks again.